I actually also started off doing reception and maintenance, of which I had no skill set for. Yeah, that giant foyer over there, PK told me to rip a bunch of stuff off and paint. And there was one day I was watching from a distance, and he was looking at my work laughing, and I was like, oh, all right, I'm getting fired. No, but it's been an honor. Good morning, East Coast International Church. It is so good to be with you all today. I just want to say thank you to Pastor Kurt for giving me the opportunity to speak with you all as we continue in our series labeled Hidden Figures. Everybody say Hidden Figures. So back when the majority of people still watched cable television, anybody still watching cable television? Right, that's the whole point. I see Mario's hand over there, but we gonna ignore it. But back when the majority of people still watch cable television, I remember seeing this one show called Undercover Boss. I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of it, but it's the show where these CEOs of these like big companies disguise themselves as regular employees so they can secretly observe how their company is actually functioning in the weeds and day-to-day operations of things. Which, by the way, if you've watched even like a minute of it, you know that every single one of those CEO disguises were terrible, like awful, like genuinely just bad. They'll put a fake mustache and glasses and just push them into their business as if like nobody's supposed to notice that it's just some new employee. Every episode I was wondering, how are people falling for this nonsense? Like, here's a couple examples. This guy, that's ridiculous. I'm sketched out the minute you walk through these doors. Then there's another one, looks like a superhero. I don't want to come to save me, right? Oh, I think we have one more. This was just bad. I just have no idea how people are falling for it. Like if there was a Sunday where we had a first-time guest coming in like this, immediately I'm saying, well, first I'm thinking, is that Billy Ray Cyrus? Then once I realize that it's not, I'm like, Pastor Kurt, take that wig off. You know, we're not falling for it. You're not getting a first-time gift bag. This is terrible. If my car got repossessed, this is who I would think would come to collect it. It's just bad luck. By the way, I don't know if you guys noticed, he's wearing the same exact shirt today, so I think that's a divine setup right there. But every episode I would watch, and obviously after my judgment of these bad disguises, I would see that the same thing would be revealed time and time again. That behind every successful company and every famous CEO, you found hidden people doing faithful work that nobody was noticing. Like the inventory worker that was just doing his tasks, the overnight cleaner, that line cook. It wasn't really the case that the highlight of every episode was this higher-up employee that's doing a phenomenal job. It was apparent that beyond the CEO's initial strategy and leadership, the success of the company oftentimes rested on the shoulders of people whose names nobody knew. And in our series, Hidden Figures, what we find is that throughout the Bible, God operates in the same way. See, the Bible is full of important leaders. Leaders that you've heard of before, maybe, like Abraham or Moses or Joshua, Peter, or Paul, these CEO-type biblical figures, people who were leads in God's plans. But behind many of those stories were these ordinary, everyday people who we quickly read past as we move on to the next verse. But these were names that, though they were mentioned once, made a major difference in somebody else's story. See, the Bible speaks of one leader in specific in the Old Testament, and his name is Jeremiah. Everybody say Jeremiah. See, Jeremiah was one of the most important prophets in the Old Testament. What I always found cool about the prophet Jeremiah was that most scholars believe that he was likely in his late teen years when he became a prophet, when God called him. So he was like a super young kid and was handpicked by God to be his representative to the nations, which sounds like a pretty awesome gig to get, right? Except Jeremiah's assignment wasn't primarily to announce God's blessings and promises or instructions on how to lead Israel to the best places possible. His assignment was actually to warn Israel that judgment was coming if they continued to live in their rebellion. This is different than what we see in a lot of other prophets. Like Moses, for example, stood before Pharaoh and he prophesied Israel's freedom. He was telling Pharaoh that God is bringing his people out. You got to let them go. But Jeremiah has to stand before Israel and prophesy their ruin. See, Moses was announcing deliverance and Jeremiah had to announce destruction. Moses' warning was directed at Israel's oppressors, but Jeremiah's warning is directed right at Israel. Like, who wants that kind of job, to just be the bearer of bad news all the time? The tragic part is that Jeremiah's message didn't come because God stopped loving Israel. It came because Israel refused to listen to him to the point where they were walking away from his protection, his instruction, and now he's letting them know where they're walking into. Jeremiah had to preach messages nobody wanted to hear. He called out their idolatry, called out their corruption, their injustice, and overall empty religion. And he gave a very clear warning that destruction and exile was coming if they did not change their ways. See, speaking on behalf of God, it sounds like a neat job until he's asking you to deliver some bad news. But even with this difficult call, Jeremiah obeyed God. But he did so in heartache. See, it's one thing to warn a person, but it's a whole other thing when it's your people. That wasn't easy for Jeremiah to do. Not because the message he was communicating was harsh, but because he knew what his very own people were walking straight into, and it broke his heart. Jeremiah is commonly called a weeping prophet because he would preach and prophesy, but not with the zeal or excitement. He would do it with legitimate tears, which, by the way, I think is a hard lesson for us to be reminded of today. That watching the consequences of judgment imposed on others, those things should not excite us. See, unfortunately, today it's become so common to celebrate the downfall of the people we oppose. And the reality is that if it brings us joy to watch somebody spiral, self-destruct, walk into ruin, and suffer the consequences of their own decisions, no matter who they are, we may need to ask God to do some surgery on our hearts. You see, because Jeremiah, he was in a place to say something. He was one of the few faithful people in his generation. He was living right. He wasn't falling for the idolatry. He wasn't falling for the deception. Yet even in that, his heart still broke for the hardness of hearts around him. Jeremiah wasn't arrogant or self-righteous or someone that was just celebrating in the destruction of Israel. He grieved it. You can speak truth boldly, you can call out consequences, but please understand that people living in the demise of their own destruction should grieve you. It shouldn't excite us because there's still people created in the image of God. There's still people God is intentionally after, and we should see them as such. It's not even my point today. That one's free for you guys. Here's my point. His message to the people was ultimately rejected after all the warnings and after all of the things he said. And it was so bad that it even got him thrown into prison. But even in the prisons, he kept on preaching and he kept on warning. And in Jeremiah 38, he preached a warning that everyone who stayed in Jerusalem would soon die from war, famine, or disease. But those who would surrender to the Babylonians, which was like the evil empire at the time, would live. Now, 3 of the recipients of this warning were these high-ranking officials who were angered because this message posed as a threat to their very own position and power. If they want to live, they got to give it all up, and they were not willing to do that. So they went to the king at the time. They accused Jeremiah of being a traitor and requested that he be killed, and the king said, all right, go ahead. And here's where we pick the story up in Jeremiah 38:6. So the officials took Jeremiah from his cell and lowered him by ropes into an empty cistern in the prison yard. It belonged to Malchijah, a member of the royal family. There was no water in the cistern, but there was a thick layer of mud at the bottom, and Jeremiah sank down into it. As a result of what God wanted Jeremiah to speak, rather than people taking the message, receiving it, and turning from their own ways and going back to God, they instead threw Jeremiah into an empty pit because of it. They left him stranded, abandoned, sinking in mud, starving, left to die slowly. A major prophet in biblical history was at the crossroads of life and premature death, and it seems as if death would have the final say. At this point, Jeremiah was powerless, and those who were in power were the ones that put him there in the first place, and they thought that they had finally silenced this prophet. But what they didn't realize was that in their midst, there was a hidden figure, and it picks up in verse 7. But Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian, an important court official, heard that Jeremiah was in the cistern. At the time, the king was holding court at the Benjamin Gate. So Ebed-Melech rushed from the palace to speak with him. My lord the king, he said, these men have done a very evil thing in putting Jeremiah the prophet into the cistern. He will soon die of hunger, for almost all the bread in the city is gone. So the king told Ebed-Melech, take 30 of my men with you and pull Jeremiah out of the cistern before he dies. So Ebed-Melech took the men with him and went to a room in the palace beneath the treasury where he found some old rags and discarded clothing. He carried these to the cistern, lowered them to Jeremiah on a rope, and Ebed-Melech called down to Jeremiah, put these rags under your armpits to protect you from the ropes. Then when Jeremiah was ready, they pulled him out. So Jeremiah was returned to the courtyard of the guard, the palace prison, where he remained. See, word was getting around that Jeremiah was sinking in a pit. This was public knowledge, yet with this knowledge, nobody was moving. You see, honestly, to the common person, Jeremiah probably had it coming. People likely believed he should have just kept his mouth shut. His words got him in trouble. He was talking too much. He put this on himself. Maybe there were even people like the officials that were like, man, you deserve every bit of it. And how often is this the narrative we fall into when we see people stuck in the pit of their lives? That rather than learning and observing how they went in, we just assume why they fell in. And I believe that we do this because if we can convince ourselves that somebody deserves the pit, we can excuse ourselves from helping pull them out. So here's the question I want us to wrestle with today. What do we do when we find someone in a pit? Because eventually all of us will encounter people stuck in a pit of their own, whether it be deception or addiction, bitterness, hopelessness, sin. When we encounter those people, how do we respond? See, because while everyone around Jeremiah ignored the pit, a hidden figure named Ebed-Melech decided to step forward. This Ethiopian court officer. And these details matter because it reveals the unique position he finds himself in. Being an Ethiopian tells us that he's a foreigner that was outside the normal social structures of Israel. He probably had no family around him or with him. He was just one individual in a place that was unfamiliar to him, and he had to grow to become accustomed to, while at the same time had his really awesome position, a pretty meaningful position. He was a court official, which means that he has direct access to the very king and authority that sent Jeremiah to the pit. He didn't have a lot, but the one thing he did have was everything for him. That gives him some pretty decent reasoning on why he should stay quiet like everyone else. He had every reason to protect himself, every reason to say, that's not my problem, I'm just doing me. Because choosing to help Jeremiah means going against the king's orders, which can put him at risk of jeopardizing the very role that he's in. But instead of overlooking, he moved toward the pit. So what set him apart like everyone else? What caused him to take on a responsibility everybody wiped their hands clean from? Well, the first thing we see is that Ebed-Melech walked towards the pit because he gave attention to the very thing everyone else was choosing to ignore. See, many people noticed the pit, but nobody cared about the person that was trapped inside of it. It's easy to point out what's broken in people's lives. It's like super easy to do this, and we see it happening all the time. People are always pointing it. Just so you know, it doesn't take spiritual maturity to be able to identify the problems around you. But Ebed-Melech shows us that if we're to have real compassion over the things we're pointing at, then it'll begin when the same hands pointing at the pit become the hands willing to help pull people out of it. I would even go as far to say is, if you're not willing to help pull people out of the pits you're pointing out, maybe stop pointing. And that includes your social media posts. Calling out the pits while ignoring the people in them does such a disservice to the kingdom of God because we become so obsessed with identifying the problem, we forget that behind every problem is a person struggling. See, when Ebed-Melech heard of the pit, he moved forward because he refused to ignore that in there was somebody worth rescuing. He saw that because he saw Jeremiah differently than how everyone else viewed him. Ebed-Melech did not reduce Jeremiah to his condition and problem. He saw Jeremiah the way God did. Everybody saw him as a traitor, as a nuisance, but Ebed-Melech saw Jeremiah as a prophet. See, long before the pit, God had already spoken over Jeremiah's life. In chapter 1, verse 5, he said, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." So while everybody else saw a problem, a traitor, or a man left for dead, Ebed-Melech saw somebody that God had called and handpicked. For Ebed-Melech, the pit did not cancel the purpose of God over Jeremiah's life. And sometimes people become so buried in failure and in shame and in the problems that surround them that everyone around them only sees them by that one thing, sees them by the pit. But followers of Jesus are called to see people differently. We're not supposed to see people based on their current condition. We're supposed to see them despite their current condition. No matter where people have sunken under, God calls us to see them as image bearers, as people who are reachable, redeemable, purpose-filled, and worthy of saving. Not as people who are defined by the pits they're stuck in. Just picture this for a second. Imagine your car getting destroyed every day by the potholes on South Common Street. It's terrible. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about. Feels like meteorites just fell there. Imagine your wheels getting messed up, your alignment's shot, your bumper is starting to hang off, and you just have this annoying scraping sound when you drive. Your first initial thought is not to get out of your car and yell at your car for all the damage it's consumed, right? The car suffered from what it had to drive through. And in our city, some streets don't give us a chance. You just got to go and hold on for dear life, praying that wheel stays, right? But in the same way, sometimes people are carrying damage from pits they did not create. They're carrying damage from pits they were pushed in, from pits that they had no choice to go around. You see, Jude 23 tells us to rescue others by snatching them from the flames of judgment, but show mercy still to others. But do so with great caution, hating the sins that contaminate their lives. In other words, we have every right to judge the pit harshly, get mad at it, but have mercy on the person trapped inside. Be mad at the pit, but show mercy to the one trapped. This is biblical compassion, not celebrating the things that people have been sinking under, while at the same time refusing to abandon the people that are trapped. Because Abimelech acknowledged what everyone else ignored, and because he saw Jeremiah as someone worth saving, he risked his position. He marched to the king, which, by the way, is the same king that told him to go ahead and kill them, and he pled his case. And by him pleading his case for Jeremiah's salvation, he essentially had to say, hey, you got it wrong, so I need you to change your mind. Which who knows how he would respond to that. But by the grace of God, the king did change his mind. He gave Abimelech 30 men to help, but then he tells him, take them with you and you pull Jeremiah out. You see, seeing people differently is one thing, but biblical compassion eventually demands your involvement. At some point, the mercy you have on somebody has to move you towards them. It wasn't enough for Abimelech to just feel bad for Jeremiah. He had to step in and do what he could. Real compassion is rarely convenient. It's always going to cost you something. For Abimelech, it was his position, it was his security, it was his time, his effort. But he did it anyways, and he got to work. He found some old robes, some rags, some clothes, finds Jeremiah, and tells him to place the rags under his arms before they pulled him out. But why? Well, because Jeremiah was stuck in mud, meaning that there was a lot of resistance that they were going to pull him out. And if they just used rope, it would have harmed him. The rope alone would have shredded his skin. And what's revealed here is that Abimelech wasn't just trying to rescue Jeremiah, but he also cared about the pain that he could experience in the rescuing. It wasn't just about pulling Jeremiah out. It was about tending to him and caring for him in the process as well. And when Jeremiah was ready, he was pulled out, and he lived to continue the mission God had him on. Not because some king advocated for Jeremiah, not because some high-ranking officials decided to change their mind, but it was because when all were in favor of allowing Jeremiah to die a slow death, a hidden figure stepped up and risked everything to see that one person be given the chance to be saved. Abimelech saw what everyone else ignored. He saw people how God did, and he was willing to get his hands dirty in the process. See, he shows us that our call to serve people, to love our neighbor like Jesus tells us to, also includes those who find themselves in a pit. And sometimes serving people isn't always about lending a hand up. Sometimes it means making a decision to step down into the pit. See, it can be easy to hear this story and simply see Abimelech of having this charitable mindset as we navigate the why in his efforts to risk it all. But Jeremiah 39 gives us deeper insight. You see, Jerusalem is falling exactly how Jeremiah warned that they would, because they're not willing to change their ways. And so Babylon invades, the city's collapsing, destruction is everywhere. But in the middle of the chaos, God gives Jeremiah a message specifically for Abimelech. He says in Jeremiah 39, say to Abimelech the Ethiopian, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says. I will do to this city everything I have threatened. I will send disaster, not prosperity. You will see its destruction. But I will rescue you from those you fear so much. Because you trusted me, I will give you your life as a reward. I will rescue you and keep you safe. I, the Lord, have spoken. Yes, it's great that he's being spared from the destruction around him, that he no longer has to be afraid of the people he's scared of. But pay attention to what God told him. His security that he now has isn't because he did a charitable thing for Jeremiah. God tells Abimelech, because you trusted me, I will give you your life as a reward. This is incredible. Abimelech wasn't just trying to do a good deed out of moral conviction. What God reveals is that Abimelech's trust in the Lord is the thing that led him to save Jeremiah. Abimelech was not leading the charge. He was actually being led. He had become part of God's rescue mission for Jeremiah, and God honored his obedience. See, having the compassion to help people in the pits they're in is not just an emotional reaction. It's not about just having a charitable mindset. It's an act of obedience. It's not a suggestion. It's actually a part of what we're called to do as followers of Jesus. Not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because loving, following, and trusting God does not just change our lives, but it changes how we see people around us. Abimelech trusted God enough to move towards somebody everyone else abandoned. And it's my belief that we're called to trust God to do the same with those around us, even if the world decided to abandon them. And thank God for the people that actually do this, because if we're all honest with ourselves, at one point or another, we found ourselves in pits too. Maybe not physical pits like Jeremiah, but maybe spiritual ones, or emotional pits, or sinful pits, or maybe within our identities. Like 15-year-old Pastor Jesse, he didn't realize it, but he was deep in pits of arrogance and lust and insecurity and spiritual blindness, and I didn't know, but I was sinking in the mud. That was until someone saw me not based on where I found myself, but based on God's purpose for my life. Josue was a friend of mine. He was my neighbor in my teen years, but more than that, he literally became the catalyst for my life. For the majority of people in this room today, Josue Quispe is not a name that you're familiar with, but for me, he's everything. In my pit, he told me about Jesus. In my pit, he invited me to a Bible study at his church, even after 3 no's. In my initial rejection, he was praying behind the scenes that I would one day say yes, and I eventually did, just to shut him up. Stop asking me. And when I went to the Bible study, still in my pit, he introduced and celebrated me with actual tears to a bunch of people I didn't know when I finally went to the Bible study, saying how thankful he was to God that his prayers were answered and that his friend finally showed up. And by showing me the love of Christ, he helped me realize that there's a whole life outside of the sunken places I realized I was in. When I gave my life to Jesus, Josue was there, using the ropes and rags of his own life to help pull me out. The late night talks and prayers, the Bible studies, the hard conversations, the invitations, his consistency and presence. He didn't just tell me to get out of the pit. He stayed committed to me, seeing me through all the way. And he never had a perfect blueprint to loving his neighbor. He honestly had really just started his own relationship with Jesus right before me. But man, he led with the trust in God that was so contagious. I remember he would walk into school with the Bible in his hand and dress shoes on and a button-up tucked into his jeans with this like church belt. Mind you, I've never lived in the South. This is happening at Malden High School. So you can just imagine, like, this is not what people wear. He didn't get the best of reception from many. Man, he did not care. He used every opportunity to be the hands and feet of Jesus. And that thing that pulled him out, he was fighting to make sure that everyone heard. There were moments at lunchrooms where he was getting laughed at from talking to one person. He didn't care, because the very same week, he was out praying after school with somebody, bringing them to tears. Josue trusted God, and it was contagious. And because of that come to Jesus moment in my life, I've been able to experience so much. I connected, grew, and eventually interned at the church that he invited me to. I attended a leadership school that would reaffirm my love for the city. I had the opportunity to leave the country for the first time to Nepal. I got connected to a pretty amazing church in downtown Lynn because of a pig roast, out of all things. I was loved here, discipled, developed, and eventually became a leader, serving a community very similar to the one I was raised in. I got to meet my amazing wife here and start a beautiful family with her. I get to walk alongside teenagers, helping them discover their life in Jesus so they can also walk in purpose and wholeness. I have the opportunity to create accessible programming for middle school students in our community. So much. And yes, God was the source of it all, and it required work and obedience on my end too, but the door only opened because God was able to use one person's boldness, who refused to ignore me in the pit, who saw me for how God made me to be, and someone who fought for me. And unfortunately, in 2015, my friend had passed away, so everything I named, he has not been able to watch. But the seeds of impact he's placed in my life are still sprouting to this very day. And as I now have the opportunity to raise up students who come from similar places, it's never my goal to try to recreate Pastor Jesse's. It's always my goal to raise up more Josue's. Because without Josue, there probably isn't a Pastor Jesse. And in the same way, without Ebed-Melech, Jeremiah doesn't continue on to do what we later see God do through his life. See, you never know who you're helping out of pits. You never know what that can do with someone's life when you're available. As a matter of fact, some of the greatest impact you'll ever have for God may come through people nobody knows you helped raise up. And here's the deeper realization. Ebed-Melech pulled Jeremiah out of his pit so Jeremiah could continue fighting for Israel to be pulled out of theirs. This was Jeremiah's task the whole time. Not to tell Israel of everything they're doing wrong, but to help them see that there is a way out, that it's not too late, that it's in God. It was all connected. But get this, Ebed-Melech's ability and availability to help one person allowed that one person to try to help a nation. That's important. Ultimately, Israel would disobey, but their disobedience reveals a human condition we all have to navigate. That humanity as a whole has found itself stuck in pits. When we chose our own way apart from God, we walked straight into a pit of our own, trapped in sin, sinking in shame, unable to rescue ourselves. And when God had every reason to point from us from heaven and say, I told you so, you deserve it, whatever it might be, he instead decided to get his hands dirty. And by Jesus coming to us on earth, taking on human flesh, God stepped into our pit. He became the ultimate ropes and rags for us by dying on the cross so that in him we can be saved from the very things we cannot rescue ourselves from. Worship team, you can come up. When Jesus has done for us, this whole act is echoed in Psalms 40, verse 2, where the psalmist says, he lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. If you still need a reason why you should be doing this, we fight to pull people out of pits because Jesus pulled us out of the one we could never rescue ourselves from. That should be enough. He gave us a firm place to stand, not so that we can walk away towards our individual freedoms, but it's so that we can dig our heels down as we participate in God's rescue mission for humanity and helping those still stuck on their own. Yep. So to those around you today finding themselves in a pit, who have you been to them in this story? Are you like the officials justifying why they should be down there? Or like the king, just bending towards the majority view of what people think? Or are you the hidden figure, making the choice to walk towards the pit everyone else is avoiding, choosing to see the person in there, doing what you can to get them out? Now that you know what you probably should do, who will you decide to be today? Let's stand. I also want to add this important note too. In Jeremiah 38, verse 12, right before Abimelech pulled him out, it says that when Jeremiah was ready, then he went and got pulled out. You see, if Abimelech pulled before Jeremiah was ready, it could have harmed him or not even be in a proper position to even do anything for Jeremiah. I think it's important to point this out because there are moments when we do the right thing. We see what others ignore. We call out purpose in the lives of those identified by their pit. We roll up our sleeves. We have the rope down. We're ready to do the work, but they're not ready. Maybe they're just not at a place or a position to be pulled out, or maybe they don't even recognize that they're sinking in the pit of their own lives yet. See, the goal is not to force them out of something they don't want to be freed from, because it can harm them even more in the end. The goal is to be available to help pull people when they're ready. If they're not ready, then it's not time. And also, if your efforts are just causing them to drag you into the pit you're trying to free them from, it's time to move on. That's not abandonment. That's acknowledgement that they're not ready to be pulled out and you're not willing to sink back in. Just don't allow that one moment to stop you from still being available to help others. There's so many people out there searching for a way out. And one person's no should never stop you from reaching out to the ones who are just waiting for the chance to say, yes, please help. Maybe today you're that one. You're in that pit. You're convincing yourself that you're doing great, but deep down you know you're stuck and you're sinking by the minute. Maybe you've been ignored for so long, you kind of accepted that nobody's going to help, or maybe you've been mislabeled by those around you. You started to believe in it. You found comfort in the sinking. And maybe you're scared of what life could look like outside of where you're at right now. I want to encourage you and let you know that Jesus has the ropes and rags that you need to find freedom today. There is a life waiting for you with Christ that is more than what we could ever imagine. So I challenge you, make the decision today to accept God's free gift of salvation. Because there's not one person who's in a pit too deep for God. There's not one point in the sinking where he can't rescue you from. Even if all you have showing is just one hand, like the end of the Terminator movie, you know, when his hands are sinking in like the lava. If all you have is a hand, it's enough to take hold of him today. So trust in God. Let him lift you out of the slimy pit you find yourselves in. Let him set your feet on a rock and give you a firm place to stand. These altars are open. And if you're ready to be in Abimelech for the kingdom of God, if you want to be somebody that sees people how God sees them, to pull them out where life has put them in, just come on up. And if you're here and you're ready for God to lift you out of the pit you cannot get out on your own, I also invite you to come to the altar today. Let us pray with you as we sing this last song.